Today's episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Switching to Mint Mobile is the easiest way to save in 2024. Wireless plans are $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. To get this new customer offer, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We are a day delayed because of the Oscar nominations coming out yesterday, and I decided to do a bit more of an evergreen segment, or something that's not directly tied to this past weekend's box office. It was kind of a lazy, lonely week at the box office anyway, so we're going to cover the weekend as we normally do, but I also want to take a good look at the DC Extended Universe, or whatever the official name for it was, as Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom begins the end of its theatrical run. We have a bit of a better idea as far as its profitability, and I wanted to look back at all of the movies in the DCEU, how they did at the box office, how they did in other revenue streams, and whether the whole enterprise was profitable for Warner Brothers / Warner Brothers Discovery / all of the other different corporate names they had in the last 10 plus years that the DCEU has been around. So we're going to look at that, and I've timestamped the video if you want to jump ahead to that, but let's look first at this past weekend at the box office, which saw Mean Girls repeat at number one, a drop of 59.3% for an $11.6 million total. Its domestic total is now just over $50 million. Less than 60% on a B cinema score may indicate that the expectations were perhaps not there, and not so much that the audience didn't like Mean Girls. It's not a great hold, but it's not a 65% plus drop like we will sometimes see for movies that get a B plus or B minus cinema score. So Mean Girls on top for a second weekend. In second place was The Beekeeper, which dropped 48.1% for another $8.6 million. Its total is now just over $31.2 million. Then we have Wonka in third place, dropping just 20.7% for a $6.7 million total. And its domestic total is now over $187.4 million. That is a very significant figure, which we'll look at later in the show. In fourth place, this was a tight competition, about $50,000 separated number 4, Migration, which dropped just 12.4% from last weekend. Families are continuing to show up, even though it's not one of the bigger hits in the Illumination catalog. $94.8 million total for Migration. Anyone But You comes in at $5.402 million, a 24.2% drop from the previous weekend. So it's also continuing to hold well. Its domestic total is now at $64.2 million. And when you look at where Migration stands worldwide, these are all of the Illumination films by worldwide gross. You can congratulate Migration because it will not be the lowest grossing Illumination film of all time. It has bypassed 2011's Hop to become number 13 on that list, but it will not bypass the Lorax, so it will remain number 13, but still out of the basement, a moral victory, if you will, for Illumination. In sixth place was Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, which dropped 30.4% at a $3.6 million total for a domestic total of about $114.1 million. Then we had ISS, which was DOA at the box office, bringing in just over $3 million for the 3-day weekend. Really no impact whatsoever for that film. Night Swim in its third weekend drops 39.7% for a $2.7 million total. Its domestic total now $23.8 million. Then we had The Boys in the Boat, which dropped 26.1% and adds another $2.5 million to its total, a $43 million total for that film. And then making, I believe, its third or second reappearance in the top 10 is Poor Things, which did finally get that expansion into over 1,000 theaters, leading into Oscar nominations. It was the second most nominated film yesterday when they announced who the nominees were. A 19.1% increase in business for a $2.1 million total. Poor Things now has a domestic total of just over $20 million. And when we look at Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, as far as worldwide gross for the DCEU, it has upset the balance of power and bypassed Black Adam. It is now number 7 all time, although again, that's as far as it's going to go. I don't believe it has another, let's say, $250 million left in the tank. So it will end as the 7th highest grossing film in DCEU history worldwide. Dropping out of the top 10 this past weekend were two films, The Iron Claw, which was in the top 10 for 4 weeks, and The Book of Clarence, which spent just 1 week in the domestic top 10. A lot of people thinking that The Iron Claw was overlooked by the Academy Awards, largely due to A24's release strategy and their screener strategy when it came to getting it out to critics. Looking at the most theaters lost for this past weekend, which was the weekend of the 19th, Night Swim actually lost the most theaters of any movie nationwide at 549, although it's still in 2,708 8 theaters. The Color Purple continues to fade away. It lost 397 theaters. It is now out of wide release and is playing in 781 theaters nationwide. Ferrari dropped about half of its remaining theaters, 335 of them. It's now playing in 327 theaters. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom lost 318 theaters. It's still in 2,400 nationwide. And the Iron Claw lost 270 theaters. However, it still remains in 1,320 theaters, faring better than some of the other movies that opened alongside it on Christmas Day. This is what I like to call our road to recovery. The red line is the box office weekend average for 2021 through 2023. The blue line are the 5 years preceding the pandemic, and then the dotted black line is what we're doing this year, and we still remain above the average since theaters started reopening, but well below the average from before theaters shut down back in 2020. The highest performing film for the 2021 to 2023 window was the continued performance of Avatar: The Way of Water. We don't have a big holiday blockbuster carrying over into January like that. And then the highest grossing film from the 2015 to 2019 window was actually American Sniper, which was moving into wide release and brought in great box office. The average for the 5 years preceding the pandemic was around $150 million, maybe a little bit more than that. We were about $100 million below that this past weekend. These were the top 5 films outside of the US and Canada. At number 1 was Johnny Keep Walking, which continues to post strong holds from weekend to weekend at $14.947 million. Then we had The Beekeeper right behind at $14.2 million. In third place was Rob and Roll, a heist comedy film from Hong Kong. Then we had Wonka at $10.6 million and Anyone But You also at $10.6 million. When you combine those international numbers with our domestic numbers, we get the top 5 films worldwide, and The Beekeeper remains the number 1 film around the world. It dropped 39.9% from its opening weekend at $22.8 million. Mean Girls drops 45.4% to be number 2 worldwide at $19.1 million. Then we have Wonka staying in third at $17.3 million, a 28.3% drop from last weekend. Anyone But You actually added 30.9% as it expands around the world. Its gross was just over $16 million, and then Johnny Keep Walking dropped 23.3% for a $14.947 million total. So that's what happened at the box office this past weekend, and we'll look at our per theater charts and everything at the end of the show as we always do. But I want to talk about the DC Extended Universe because it has officially now drawn to a close with Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. And while it is still in theaters, it's still in the top 10, I don't think it's going to be bringing in an immensely large amount of money still. It's had great legs. It just opened very low, so those legs have not translated into huge profitability. And that got me to thinking about the profitability of the DCEU as a whole. If you go all the way back to Man of Steel in 2013, how much have the movies made or lost theatrically? And then when you include all revenue streams, is there an estimate to how much the whole enterprise might have brought into the studio? Well, let's answer the question that's easiest to answer first, which is how did these movies do theatrically? I have these numbers. I know the basic percentages that are held back from China and held back internationally and held back from theaters domestically. So these are a lot easier for me to estimate. And let's take the movies one by one. Now, I'm going to put a bunch of numbers up on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of them for every movie because that would take forever, but you can freeze the video if you want and take a look at each one of those numbers. But let's kind of go chronologically through the DCEU first of all, and we'll start with the first DCEU film, which was Man of Steel. You can see its box office totals there. Remember that losing money at the box office doesn't necessarily make a film a flop. Obviously, if you're the studio, you would like for that movie to break even or get close to breaking even. Man of Steel did not, by my estimations, break even when considering solely box office receipts, but it was only $39.2 million in the red. Warner Brothers will take that because it's easy to turn a profit on the movie when it's that close to breaking even solely in the theatrical window. But I think that may be why some people talk about Man of Steel not as a flop, but as perhaps a disappointment for the studio, because while it was not a money loser, as we'll see in a few minutes, it was not a huge money earner. And you would think that if you're relaunching Superman and you're going to, be putting it out worldwide, that it might be one of those movies that generates a huge profit margin just from the theatrical window. That's not what happened with Man of Steel. Then we go to Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, and really everything I said about Man of Steel, double that for this film. It had an estimated theatrical loss of $24.8 million by my calculations, just looking at box office receipts. And again, that's an easy path to profitability, but when you have Batman and Superman meeting in a film for the first time, the expectations, I would think, from the studio would be that you would find profitability in the theatrical window. That's not necessarily what happened with BVS. And again, I think that's why that movie is not a flop necessarily. I think you look at the box office gross, it made a lot of money. It just seems like it should have made more given what it was. My estimations say that DC actually turned a profit theatrically for the first time with 2016's Suicide Squad, which I have bringing in about $28.2 million theatrically before you consider any other ancillary revenue streams. Suicide Squad was a bit of a punchline for many reasons, but it did make money. And then they go on a bit of a tear. We have Wonder Woman, which I estimate brought in $73.9 million in theatrical profit alone. This is a big hit movie. The budget was lower than some of the other films. And look at the domestic picture particularly. A big week 1, a big week 2, and then the legs on that movie. $178.7 million of Wonder Woman's gross domestically was made in week 3 and onward. And remember, studios like to have success in China and other countries, but they take the biggest chunk out of the domestic gross. So if a movie does well domestically, that's the big chunk of money that comes back to the studio, and Wonder Woman did do very well domestically. Then we have Justice League, which I think would be the first major disappointment in the DCEU. As you can see, I have an estimated loss for that film of $165.5 million, largely because it had a $300 million budget reportedly. Well, I mean, that's not shocking considering how much of it they reshot. And these, by the way, budget and advertising figures, these are publicly available, publicly sourced figures. I tried to find news stories. The advertising budgets for a lot of these films aren't readily available, so I tried to look at similar movies and the advertising budgets for those films. This is all an estimation. You can move the numbers a little bit either way. It's just meant to give you a basic idea of how these films did. And so while Man of Steel and BVS weren't quite the money generators that I think the studio wanted, Justice League was the first one where they seriously looked at the prospect of losing money altogether with one of their DC films. They rebounded though with Aquaman, which by my calculation was easily the biggest hit theatrically in the DCEU out of every film they released. I estimated a $153.7 million profit coming back to the studios just from the theatrical release. It brought in over $1.1 billion worldwide and also had a great theatrical domestic run where week 3 plus was still over $100 million. So it was a movie that opened big, it was big around the world, it stayed big in theaters. It's what you want from a holiday release if you're a studio. And this was the peak, if you're Warner Brothers, of the DC cinematic universe as far as bringing in theatrical grosses and receipts. Unfortunately, things started to go downhill from here. 2019's Shazam was close to what they saw with Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, where it did not turn a profit in the theatrical window, but had an easy road to profitability once you consider all other ancillaries. I estimate that it lost about $42.8 million theatrically. Birds of Prey basically doubled that loss theatrically, despite a lower budget. I estimate that film lost $84 million in the theatrical window. Again, a viable path to profitability, but certainly not as easy as a $50 million or less loss theatrically. And then things start getting really bad. And for these next few films, there are several caveats. Number one, the pandemic. Yes, there are things here that you can't control. Not all movie theaters were open. You had the whole Project Popcorn thing where movies were streaming on HBO Max the same day they were out in theaters. We don't really know what streaming revenue was or how it was folded in because it's a completely different division and it's not attached to a specific movie. So yes, there are a lot of gray areas in these pandemic era movies, but I can only go off the information that's available to me. And we'll start with Wonder Woman 1984, which to be fair was budgeted pre-pandemic, but which I calculate lost $229.3 million for DC in the theatrical window. Its worldwide gross was only $169.6 million. It didn't have a huge theatrical release. It came out really before theaters were even actually back open again. And this was largely a streaming play. It had a nominal theatrical release, but was meant to promote HBO Max. I estimate that that strategy cost them $229.3 million theatrically. The Suicide Squad, which came out the following summer, again, a movie that was day and date streaming on HBO Max, I estimate a $207 million estimated loss theatrically. That's off a budget of $185 million and another $100 million in marketing. And I think this gross was heavily impacted by people being able to watch it at home immediately. And let's be frank, by having a high quality pirated version available immediately. Then we go back to the theatrical era and Black Adam. I know The Rock said that this movie made money. Well, not theatrically, because I estimate the theatrical loss for Black Adam at about $115.6 million. That's largely because the movie cost about $300 million to make and market. Is there any reason a Black Adam movie should have cost $300 million? Probably not, but I think it really says something about this latter half of the DCEU that this is considered to be one of the bigger successes in the waning days of these DC films. And then we get to 2023, which started with Shazam! Fury of the Gods. I estimate that film lost $137.3 million theatrically. Really, the only saving grace is that its budget was $125 million, and they reportedly cut the marketing budget to under $100 million, but still a big money loser for DC. Then we have the big one, The Flash. Not only the biggest flop in DC history, but maybe the biggest flop in Warner Brothers history. I estimated a theatrical loss of $226.8 million. That's with a $225 million budget, another $125 million for marketing. DC and Warner Brothers went all in. I estimate that they put $350 million into the film overall, and they did not get a return on investment. They took basically a $250 million loss on that film. I also estimate that Blue Beetle lost over $100 million despite a more responsible budget of $105 million and a marketing budget around $75 million. Again, they just weren't able to draw people out in numbers big enough even with those smaller budgets. So $117 million loss on Blue Beetle. And then Aquaman. As of right now, I'm projecting that Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is losing $137.6 million for DC and Warner Brothers in the theatrical window. That may get cut down to around $120 million or so, which given its large budget is impressive. It's only going to lose about as much money as Blue Beetle did for the studio. But again, it's a very qualified success. It's not that the movie did well, it just didn't do as bad as the other films. So when we look at theatrical ticket sales only, without looking at any other sources of revenue, was the DCEU profitable for the studio? Well, no, it was not profitable. In fact, it was very unprofitable. When you add up or subtract all of these different numbers that I just gave you, and you can look at this breakdown right here, only 3 of the 15 DCEU films I project made money at all in the theatrical window, and I estimate a theatrical loss overall of $1.2 billion across the entire franchise when you only consider box office receipts. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's not what they were going for. A studio wants a movie to break even theatrically or come close to breaking even, and that's not what happened with the DCEU in any way, shape, or form. However, as I often say on this show, there are other revenue streams to consider when we're talking about these films that are not as readily available as box office receipts. But because a lot of these films came out a while ago, I was able to look up and research and find more information about how much movies like Man of Steel and Batman v Superman and Justice League, many of the earlier DC films made after their theatrical runs in other forms of revenue. For example, domestic physical media sales. The website The Numbers, which is a great box office website, actually lists this, and you can see that Man of Steel brought in $120.7 million, they estimate, in DVD and Blu-ray sales. That easily pushes that film into profitability. $82 million in physical media for Batman v Superman, $87 million for Suicide Squad, $98 million for Wonder Woman, $74.7 million for Justice League, and $72.3 million for Shazam. So these films were putting up $70 to $100 million or more in physical media sales on top of those box office receipts. And for those early movies, that's great because it pushed almost every single one of them either into profitability or into more profitability. But this is part of the system that the studios just dismantled, because look at the decline of the revenue in physical media sales. Shazam reportedly only bringing in $30 million in physical media sales. Same with Birds of Prey. Wonder Woman 1984 bringing in $40 million, far less than half what the original film brought in. The Suicide Squad, $15 million. Black Adam, $15 million. So while domestic physical media profits overall were about $668 million, it is a market that the studios themselves have largely dismantled by sending everything to streaming. And this is when I say that I really think that they were short-sighted in what they did, because you had a machine that had been working for decades a certain way. You put a movie out in theaters, and this is the profitability model. You put a movie out on physical media, and this is the profitability model. You would sell a movie to a pay one window, an HBO, and then you would license it to a network or cable, TNT, whatever. That's just how it worked. And they dismantled all of that to chase streaming revenue? Well, you can see from this physical media chart just how much money they were costing themselves in the hope of generating even more revenue, which for many of those studios, that has not happened. Of course, physical media is just one of the revenue streams for different films. And the great thing about these movies being older is that there have been write-ups about them, and the website Deadline, which does a lot of industry reporting, actually did profitability breakdowns on the biggest hits in the DC universe, and we can see what they estimated their total profits were. Not only when you add in things like licensing to Netflix or network or streaming or whatever, but also when you take out things like participations and royalties and stuff like that. They have an estimated number for a lot of these films that takes everything into account outside of things like merchandising and things that are sort of cross-departmental things. So let's look at the final estimated profitability for the DC films that made money according to Deadline. Deadline estimated that Man of Steel ended up making $42.7 million for the studio. Batman v Superman generated $105.7 million total. Suicide Squad, $158.4 million. Wonder Woman, $252.9 million. Aquaman, $260.5 million, and Shazam, $74 million. So this is profitability. This is return on investment. And when we look at these numbers, we have a known profitability number of $894.2 million. That's where I can find a source. Known losses as far as the box office goes, as I mentioned, of $1.2 billion. So that leaves the studios $350 million in the hole. So to get down to the core of the question, did the DCEU make money? Was the DCEU overall profitable for the studio? Then the real question is, did these 9 films generate $350 million in revenue that I don't have a listing for, what I call unlisted revenue? That is what pushes the DCU into profitability or loss. And when we break it down one by one, Justice League, I have $90 million in the hole. I think it's possible that it eventually turned a profit for the studio. Birds of Prey, I have it $52.8 million in the hole. I think it's probable that they were able to generate a profit when you consider all of the other revenue streams. Wonder Woman 1984 and The Suicide Squad both lost over $190 million for the studio. I deem that unlikely that they turned a profit. Black Adam is just under $100 million in the hole once you factor in physical media and what we know, so I deem that possible. Shazam! Fury of the Gods, this is a borderline case. I almost said that it was unlikely that it turned a profit, but I guess you could squint and say maybe it could bring in another $137.3 million in revenue somehow. It's much closer to unlikely than possible that it was able to turn revenue, but I put it in the possible category. The Flash lost $226 million. Not only is it unlikely, I think it's nearly impossible that the movie actually was able to turn a profit of any kind. Blue Beetle at $117 million in the hole, and Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom at $137 million in the hole. Again, I'm deeming it possible that they were able to bring in enough revenue from other streams to turn a profit. But of all the movies where I said that it's possible they turned a profit, that's 5 of those 9, it would have just barely been a profit. Birds of Prey, I think, probably turned a nice profit, not a big one, but one that the studio is probably happy with. And then Wonder Woman 1984, The Suicide Squad, and The Flash, I think all lost the studio a large sum of money. So looking at all of this data overall, and knowing that some of it is just unknown, I think that it is likely that when you include all revenue streams, that the DCEU was a money loser for the studio, or maybe generated a slight amount of profit. It certainly was not a runaway success for Warner Brothers. It started out that way. The first several years, even though the movies took some critical hits and, there was not necessarily the performance that the studio would have wanted, they were revenue producing films. But as we got into the pandemic era and then things sort of started misfiring, they started making adjustments on the fly, things just sort of fell apart. And that's not even counting the costs that went into the Snyder Cut and all of that stuff. So let's say that the DC films were able to barely turn a profit. The next question becomes, well, okay, was it profitable? Maybe. Was it worth it? Was 10 years of work and development and the IP and putting the work and time into these characters worth maybe turning a slight profit for the studio? I think some people would say no. Fans of the movies maybe would say yes, but I don't think that that's what Warner Brothers had in mind when they set their sights on relaunching the entire DC universe, 10 years ago? Over 10 years ago. So for people that like the characters, the performances in some of these individual movies, you don't have to tie whether it was worth it it to a fiscal number. If it's worth it to you because you like the movie, then that's fine. But I think that many people inside of Warner Brothers looking at these numbers might look back at the box office performance, look at those first few films, wonder what happened, and then determine that maybe, just maybe, this whole enterprise wasn't worth the time, energy, money, and trouble that was put into it. So that's my look at the DCEU. Let's turn now to one of my favorite new features here on the show, the Mint Mobile Hotline, where you get to call and ask your questions. And I'd like for you to call and leave a question to answer here on the show. The Mint Mobile Hotline number is +1 323 863 3311. And our first question comes from Andrew in New Jersey.
Hey Dan, first time, long time. This is Andrew from New Jersey. My question is about your process for creating all the beautiful charts we see on Charts with Dan every week. Specifically, what sort of sources are you scraping your data from? How are you pulling it all together? And how are you updating the charts on a weekly basis? Thanks for doing all that you do. Love the show.
Thanks, Andrew. And that is a question that I get a lot. As far as the sources for my numbers, I cross-reference the box office every weekend from a few different sources. There's a website called The Numbers. There's Box Office Mojo, which used to be a lot better, but isn't so great anymore. There's also a Canadian website called Tribute.ca, which technically is reporting Canadian grosses, but sometimes it has films domestically that the other sites don't have. And then ComScore is sort of the industry standard. I don't have the back end, the fancy part that the studios have that breaks down things in a very kind of molecular level. But they do report the domestic weekend box office, so I can double check those totals. And they report international numbers. That's where I get the international numbers from. So it's a number of different sites. I cross-reference. I make sure that the numbers are all lining up. As far as the charts themselves, most of them I design and make every week in Photoshop. I have templates that I made at this point years and years ago that I sort of update and try to keep fresh and give it a fresh coat of paint every once in a while. Some stuff like the Road to Recovery chart I do in PowerPoint. So that's made every week with spreadsheets and a PowerPoint. And, that's probably why it doesn't look as good as the other charts. I'm not an expert here. I'm doing what I can. But PowerPoint and Photoshop are the two main programs that I make the charts in, and then everything is edited on my computer using Adobe Premiere Pro. So that's my workflow. I'm sure there's probably easier ways to do a bunch of this stuff, but it's the way I know how to do it, and it's the way I like to do it. Our next question is from Tristan, and it's about a film that he thinks isn't getting enough press for being a box office disappointment.
Hi, Dan. This is Tristan. I'm curious about Ferrari. I feel like every time you go through charts, you kind of skip over, but it's a movie that's reported, I believe, $100 million budget, and it just passed 10 million. I feel like it's the biggest flop of last year, and that's something there was a lot of flops. So I just want to get your opinion on, is Ferrari the biggest flop of last year? Thank you. Bye.
Hey, Tristan, you're right. I mean, with the crush of holiday releases, Ferrari's failure is something that was somewhat glossed over. I think maybe because we've had so many huge box office losers this year that it didn't really seem as big, even though in past years it would certainly have been more notable. It's not the biggest flop of the year. That would be the Marvels or the Flash or any number of Disney releases that lost over $200 million. And Ferrari's also in a bit of a unique position. It cost $95 to $100 million. That money was put up by the company STX and also some private investors. Domestically, Neon, which is one of my favorite distributors that's working in Hollywood, paid reportedly around $15 million to distribute the film, and they would then take a cut. If it had done well, they would have taken a cut of the profits. They also paid about another $5 million to promote the film. So Neon is actually insulated somewhat from the losses that Ferrari is going to take. It got some other overseas and international distribution deals. But yes, it is a big money loser. It is not the biggest flop of the year. And as far as exposure, it's a lot of private donors and a lot of private investors, and then STX, the company that bankrolled the film, that will take the brunt of those losses. I'm sure that Neon is probably not going to make their initial investment back, but their investment was so low that it's not going to be something that I think is, ruinous to the company. But yeah, it's just an example of how perspective really every year, a $100 million movie making $30 million worldwide would have been a huge story 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. But in the context of what we've seen this year, it really just kind of felt like a drop in the bucket. Thanks so much to everybody who called in and left a question on the Mint Mobile hotline. And of course, I want to thank the people responsible for the Mint Mobile hotline, Mint Mobile. You know what never sucks? Saving money. I've never saved money and thought, man, I wish I'd been dumber with my cash. Luckily, Mint Mobile's here to help saving money not suck. With a new limited time offer, wireless plans from Mint Mobile are now $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. That's unlimited talk, text, and data for just $15 a month. Did you ever find $5 in your coat pocket? You know that great feeling, right? Well, imagine that Mint Mobile is stuffing your coat pockets with all the money you'd save by switching from your current wireless provider. That's a lot of extra cash to do whatever you want with, like buy a new coat that strangers haven't reached into. At Mint, all plans come with unlimited talk and text, plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network, and you can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all of your existing contacts. So ditch that overpriced contract today and switch to Mint. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/Murrell. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. All right, let's continue our breakdown of the past weekend at the box office, and we will look at the per theater average chart. At number 1 was the film Inside the Yellow Cocoon Shell, playing in just 2 theaters, which brought in $7,411 per theater. This is a film from Vietnam and winner of the Camera d'Or, or Best First Feature Prize, at last year's Cannes Film Festival. In second place was Ava DuVernay's Origin in 125 theaters. It brought in $6,610 per theater. Not able to get an award season campaign really underway, but it is doing well in the limited release market. The Zone of Interest is in third place. It brings in $5,459 per theater in 82 theaters. In fourth place, playing in 2 theaters, is One from the Heart Reprise, a 4K restoration of Francis Ford Coppola's 1982 musical set in Las Vegas. And in fifth place was Queen Rock Montreal, an IMAX release of a Queen show from many years ago. It played in 387 theaters, bringing in $5,168 per theater. As far as the films playing in limited release, this is 1,000 theaters or fewer. Poor Things has passed this barrier, which is why you don't see it this week. Queen Rock Montreal was number 1 at $2 million, playing in 387 theaters, followed by American Fiction, which is almost expanded into wide release. It's now in 850 theaters. It brought in $1.7 million. Origin in 125 theaters brought in $826,000, followed by All of Us Strangers in 295 theaters with $556,000, and The Zone of Interest, now a multi-Oscar nominee, at $447,000 in 82 theaters. When we look at the top 10 grossers in limited release this year, this is tickets sold as of January 1st. You see Poor Things is still at number 1, but I put that asterisk there because I froze its gross once it broke that 1,000 theater barrier. So it will continue to make money, but it won't be reflected on this chart. This is just money made while it was in under 1,000 theaters, but it's still number 1 for now at just over $8 million. American Fiction is in second place at $6.3 million. The elusive box office numbers of Gunter Karam right now put it in third place at $2.5 million, with Hanuman in fourth place at $2.3 million. Queen Rock Montreal enters the chart at number 5 with $2 million, followed by All of Us Strangers and The Zone of Interest. Origin returns to the charts at number 8 with $826,000, followed by Freud's Last Session at just over $420,000, and Salar Part 1 Ceasefire, which drops 3 spots to number 10. Memory, Fallen Leaves, and Donkey all drop out of the top 10. And of course, many of these independent films can be found in the various independent theaters that are scattered around the country and around the world. It's something that I haven't done for the last couple weeks, but I wanted to resume this week. And this week I'm featuring a theater called the Can-Can in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is a reference to a term in Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle. Can-Can's goal is to bring movie lovers together and was the dream of 2 father-son duos who founded the Indianapolis Film Project, a 501c3 organization dedicated to film education and celebration, which led to the construction of the Can-Can Theater, an indie cinema that also programs themed revivals and includes a full restaurant if you want to do a big night out. The Can-Can was originally slated to open in April of 2020, much like this channel, but was delayed by the pandemic. However, it is now up and running and currently showing All of Us Strangers, Poor Things, American Fiction, and soon The Zone of Interest. They also have some really fun events coming up, like an all-day marathon of Groundhog Day on Groundhog Day and 2 triple feature showings of Richard Richard Linklater's Before trilogy right around February 14th, and there's also an April dedicated to the films of Pedro Almodovar coming up later. To learn more about this theater, and it really looks like a great theater, you can go to cancanindy.com. That's can with a K, K-A-N. You can also make a tax-deductible donation at that website to the Indianapolis Film Project, and if you do any of those things, as always, be sure to tell them that Dan sent you. Well, 2023 is wrapped up, but we still have some motion on the 2023 charts, and it all has to do with Wonka. So let's first look at the 2023 fall holiday box office chart. This was all movies released after Labor Day, and Wonka now rules that chart at $187.4 million. It is now the highest grossing film of the fall holiday box office window. Taylor Swift: The Eras Tour moves down now to second place. Then we have The Hunger Games: The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, Five Nights at Freddy's, and Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom rounding out the top 5. And Wonka is now one of the 10 highest grossing movies released in 2023. Even though a lot of that came in calendar year 2024, we backdate that for the 2023 domestic box office. As of now, it is the 8th highest grossing film of 2023. It bumps John Wick Chapter 4 down to number 9, Sound of Freedom down to number 10, and Taylor Swift: The Eras Tour off the domestic top 10 altogether. So Wonka will now be one of the 10 highest grossing films historically of 2023. Looking at the 2024 domestic box office, so these were films released after January 1st. Mean Girls is number 1 at $50 million, followed by The Beekeeper at $31.2 million. Night Swim bumps down one spot to number 3 at $23.8 million. Then we have The Book of Clarence in 4th place, ISS in 5th, Gunter Karam in 6th, Hanuman in 7th, and Queen Rock Montreal at 8th. These are all grosses of $1 million or higher, and it probably should be full by this time next week. Looking at the domestic box office as far as calendar gross, this is all tickets sold since January 1st. Wonka's at number 1 for now with $54.3 million in sales this calendar year, followed by Mean Girls in 2nd place at just over $50 million. Migration moves down one spot to 3rd place at $40.7 million, but Anyone But You is heading up this chart quickly. It's currently in 4th place at $39.3 million. It's sold more tickets this year than Aquaman and the Last Kingdom, which is now in 5th place. The Beekeeper moves up one spot to 6th. Night Swim moves down one spot to 7th. The Boys in the Boat stays in 8th place. The Iron Claw moves up one spot to 9th. And The Color Purple moves down one spot to number 10. Looking at the 2024 worldwide box office, these are grosses that I am able to get through a variety of different sources. They're always a bit in flux as we begin the year. The Beekeeper right now, according to my sources, is the highest grossing film of the year at $75.4 million worldwide, followed by Mean Girls at $66.2 million. Night Swim is in 3rd place at $37 million, followed by the films Son of a Rich 2 and The Bremertown Musicians. In 6th place is China's Rob and Roll, followed by Poland's Klex Academy. South Korea's Alienoid Return to the Future is in 8th place. Then we have the US's The Book of Clarence and ISS rounding out the top 10. Before we wrap up, as always, I like to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we are going back to January 15th through the 17th, 1999, the 3rd weekend of that year. Did you ever have a weekend that was so memorable that you can feel it? Like when you think about it, you can almost experience it again in your memory. That was this weekend for me. I had just turned 16. It was my 2nd weekend, I think, of actual freedom, being able to drive and go out on my own. I went with my friends. We snuck in to see Varsity Blues because we bought tickets to an R-rated movie. We were all 16. We were just going to walk in, but one of my friends who got caught narked on us, we walked through, they carded him, and he said, well, they're not 17 either. And so we all got kicked out, and I'm not proud of this, but we went in through the exit and snuck into the theater to see Varsity Blues, played the soundtrack in my car. It was just the feeling of freedom. It's one of those weekends when I see Varsity Blues, it's like a sense memory. I can go back to that spot in time, and that's one of the things I love about movies. Everybody has a weekend like that or a movie like that, and that's Varsity Blues for me. What a dumb movie, I know, too, to have that weekend for me in my history. But Varsity Blues was the number 1 movie for the weekend of January 15th to the 17th, 1999. It opened to $17.5 million. It would eventually make over $50 million. Patch Adams, which I did not enjoy, that has a sense memory in a bad way for me. $12 million in its 4th week for a $98.6 million total. It would eventually gross $135 million domestically. A civil action starring John Travolta in its fourth week was in third place at $11.7 million. Its domestic gross was also just over $50 million eventually. The Thin Red Line from Terrence Malick, seen by many as a competitor to Saving Private Ryan for the Academy Award, at least a similar film, $11.3 million in its fourth week, but that big bump in business, 790%, was because it was in limited release and this was its wide release weekend. It would only end up making $36.4 million. And then in fifth place, Val Kilmer and Mira Sorvino's At First Sight, $8.4 million. It would only be able to muster $22.3 million in domestic final totals. Of course, we don't like to leave those numbers where they are 25 years ago. We like to adjust for inflation. And once we hit that inflation button, we see that Varsity Blues opened to an adjusted total of $32 million for a final domestic of $96.7 million, with Patch Adams at $22 million and an adjusted final domestic at just under $250 million. A Civil Action was in third place at $21.5 million. Its final adjusted domestic total was $103.7 million. The Thin Red Line at $20.7 million for a final total at $66.5 million. And then At First Sight at $15.4 million and a final domestic adjusted total of $40.9 million. And that does it for Charts with Dan for this week. If you didn't see my video covering the Oscar nominations, you can check that out. That came out yesterday morning. Coming up this weekend, there's really nothing going on again at the box office. The studios just left January to die, probably largely motivated by the strike. Miller's Girl, starring Jenna Ortega and Martin Freeman, is the only new major release that's hitting theaters this weekend, although there's a film called Sometimes I Think About Dying, starring Daisy Ridley, that actually played the Sundance Film Festival last year that I quite enjoyed. It's just now getting a very limited theatrical release. If you're in a major city and the movie is playing near you, I would recommend seeing it. I thought that it was very good, and I'm sad that it's not getting a bigger push or a better release, at least not wide. It'll probably be, I would imagine, available for streaming very soon. Speaking of Sundance, the online portion launches later this week. I'll be watching a bunch of movies, and next week I'll be reporting back on what I saw, as well as, movie news, reviews, box office, everything that I do right here. Thank you so much for spending a big chunk of your day with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.